So what was going into this film? What were your ideas for the score?
Yeah, I've worked on all of his films, but Shotgun Story is his first one. His brother, Ben Nichols, did that, and he's in the band Lucero, and he's done the end credit songs for all of Jeff's movies. So, but anyway, that's just an aside. This movie, the idea for this one versus his others was that I've worked on. The main difference was, so we've always had orchestral elements in all the scores. There's always been strings, Take Shelter, and Mud. We had to do, it was low budget, so we had to do sort of on the cheap, but was also surrounded by other elements, more contemporary elements, guitar, samples, synth, same with Midnight Special. And this time was the first time that we knew just that he was wanting to make this really feel like a real classic. So we knew that the score, at least Mildred and Richard's themes, the like main love themes, and then also the kind of melancholy theme when they had to leave home, were going to be just orchestral. It was just going to be strings and brass because we wanted to feel like it could have been from any time, because he wanted the story to kind of have a universal feel and not be grounded in necessarily present day sounds. So that was one big thing in how we approached it.
Okay, so there's a lot of different elements that would go into this score. I mean, there's the fact that it's a period film, it's a romance, it's set in the South and in DC, covers a lot of time. So let's start with just expressing the romance of it. How did you do that in the score?
Yes, that was always when Jeff first talked about the movie to me, it was always talking about it as first and foremost a love story. That was really how he was approaching it. It was his way. He thinks that just capturing the grace and beauty of Richard and Mildred throughout all this was really what the story was to him, and kind of on its own was able to really tell the entire story, just being like the simplicity of just that, like that these are two people that loved each other unconditionally and and that he saw it as being a very just beautiful love story. So that was why, for those main themes, the Richard and Mildred themes that needed to be able to, Jeff's approach is always sort of a less is more approach, both with his writing and with his direction, with the acting. And so as we've worked together more, I think I'm able to translate that better every time through my music, understanding that that's how he tells his story, and the music needs to operate in the same way. So we knew from the beginning that their music, the kind of their world's music, not because then there's a whole other theme that is like the tension music when they're away and the fear and peril that they live in, the music that would have to capture that. But as far as the romance music, the love music, their themes just needed to, like I said, feel timeless and feel not necessarily contemporary, and just feel like something that was elemental in that way and could just really capture the simple grace and beauty of them and their relationship, and without being at all sentimental about it, and without being frilly about it and a lot of bells and whistles, and just have it. And also with the visuals it was a very lush movie, I feel like, visually, and it felt like kind of a classic American film just visually. So we just wanted the music to be able to really fit into that world and capture a certain amount of beauty and be simple in a lot of ways, really not overstate his case, basically, but still really add to everything else in the film that was just sort of elemental and beautiful.
So then how did you do that? I mean, there is a subtlety to the music that I think keeps it from being like the made-for-TV movie version of this, shall we say. How do you avoid hitting all of the, let's say, obvious emotions while still conveying this love story?
I think it's about paring everything down to the essentials, honestly. And that's a lot of what it always is working with Jeff. I've loved that about working with him. And it's something I had to learn to do through I think with Take Shelter and Mud, for example, the first two films of his I worked on, there was a lot of me turning in stuff and him being like, I like this and I like that, but let's strip it back down. Let's get it back down. And so I think with Midnight Special, really started understanding that and learning that let's get a few key elements that are really, for him, capturing what the movie is about. They really add to what he's trying to do with it, and letting those speak for themselves. And it's kind of like if you're cooking a meal, you know, not overdoing it with ingredients, not trying to get too fancy with it all. Like, let's take a couple of essential things that make, if you're cooking a steak, you're gonna salt and pepper it and get a good piece of steak and cook it the right amount of time. We're good to go. I feel like it's sort of that thing. Like, let's not get too don't overthink it. Just you know, there could have been times where I could have had like a really sort of a fanciful violin solo that comes in over the music, but at this point I know, no, that's not what that's not what he's going to want. That's going to be too much. That's going to be too on the nose, leading the audience too much into this. It's like, just let it be. Jeff likes a lot of just musically, he just likes a full lush sound and tone rather than to have it go a million all over the place, sort of. And that was something I learned on Mud as well. Like, he always was, there was a time where he's like, I really just want to hear this French horn spot here. So I kept trying these like melodic French horn lines, and he kept being like, no, I don't, that's still too much. And it wasn't until we just had a horn player just play a long note. He's like, perfect. It was like, he literally just wanted the sound of a French horn, and it was perfect. It kind of gave it, it's coloring. A lot of the time with Jeff, it's coloring with sounds and tones in a lot of ways, but not making ambient music. It's not just a wash of sound. We're still writing music. Not that I make ambient music all the time. I'm not saying that's not music, but writing a song. We're writing a song that has movements to it, but just really paring it down to the bare essentials, I think, is the key.
Right. And in terms of conveying the time and place, 1950s Virginia into the 60s, can you talk about conveying that period and that place?
Yeah, that was something that we didn't usually. We do think of the music in terms of regionalism, especially with Mud. We certainly did, and this time we didn't, because it was more of he was wanting to tell this in a more universal way. I think it was important to the story of them and what the story is about and what they were going through was about. This wasn't about trying to set this as if it was just a complete time and place thing, although, because it's something that's, you know, elements of what was happening to them are obviously still happening today and here and everywhere else. Wanted to make it sort of just universality of their love and of anyone's love in these situations. And so I think in that regard, we wanted to stay away a little bit from basing it so much in a sense of place. Yeah.
It does give it more a sense of immediacy, I think, you know, like there's not that emotional barrier, I guess, in saying like, well, that's the kind of thing that would happen back then, as opposed to, you know, it feels like it's happening now, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Obviously, yeah, this, you know, was coming. Jeff was writing this, I think, when the LGBT gay marriage debates were going on. And so that was certainly something that was being, obviously had to know that. And then, of course, the Loving case was cited in the Supreme Court decision on it. So, yeah, didn't want to just make it a time and place thing.
Right. You brought up Midnight Special earlier, and I mean, it's amazing. These two movies came out in the same year, so I'm assuming that made them pretty much back to back. Can you talk? And they're so different in terms of style, genre, tone. Can you talk about going from one to the other? I mean, how do you just switch your brain off, or switch it to a different kind of score?
Yeah, we actually, those weren't really straight back to back because Midnight Special didn't come out for a little while after we were finished making it. So there was, I think, a good 10 months in between. I worked on some other projects in that time. So it wasn't just having to switch from one to the other, really. But as far as the difference, That's been the interesting thing about working with Jeff. There's always some commonalities to all the score as far as our approach in the ways I was talking about. But, you know, from Mud to Midnight Special was obviously a huge change. Mud was a pretty Americana type score, but still had orchestral elements, but did base that sort of in regionalism with the guitars and slide guitars and whatnot. And then Midnight Special, obviously, we knew we were going to be kind of doing a influenced by the Spielberg and especially John Carpenter scores. So, yeah, if it had been, but you know, that's what film scoring is. You do one project, and you know the next will be a totally different thing, and you just have that. You know, when I'm done with one thing, you just go back to the blank canvas, and I'm watching a whole different thing, and you're seeing it all in a different way. So that's never really been too much of an issue, having to switch.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it helps having you know, some consistency in the filmmaker that you're working with. Can you talk about the benefits of working with someone from film to film to film the way you do with Jeff?
Absolutely. That's how I really learned how to score films, was through David Gordon Green. I met Jeff through David Gordon Green. I scored David's student films and then all of his films after that, except for 2. So I think there's been 9 or 10 films. No, maybe not that many. Maybe about that many. Anyway, whatever it is, I've lost count. And so that's how I came up scoring films. The first several films I did were just David. So it was a way of like collaboration with the director is how I learned how to really do this. And so once I started working with Jeff, who I met through David, it was the same thing. Talking about music is takes its own special set of tools. And whenever you're working for the first time with someone, it's sort of like having to translate a language almost, be like to know what they mean when they say they're saying they want a certain feel or sound or emotion. It's also subjective. That might mean one thing to you and it might mean something. Like sometimes what I think is not at all melancholy to someone else will seem just completely sad. And so it's about learning their vision, really, and how to translate that. And with every time you do it, you can talk about it a lot easier because you have an understanding of what each other means when you say things. And then just understanding his, like I said earlier, his sort of paring everything down to the essentials aesthetic a lot of the way, in the way he works is the way that he doesn't have a lot of dialogue in the films for the most part, and make sure that the dialogue that there is really is impactful and tells the stories, and he likes, you know, lingering on people's faces and letting that tell the story, and loving obviously so much of that. So it's really learning how to look at that over time with Jeff and seeing how much the small gestures and the small lines that tell the story, and to not step on them and to accentuate them when necessary, but to really be restrained and really learn what that means with him, because it's not like that with other directors I work with all the time and on other films. So it's about learning everyone's own. Jeff has a definite vision, and all the 4 movies I've worked with him with are so different in terms of their content, but they all do have that same approach. It's all his vision. You can tell that they're Jeff Nichols movies. So I think it's just learning that, and I think it's just going to keep being easier every time, which is the great thing about it.
Absolutely. Well, it's a great movie, and